गुड इवनिंग जेंटलमैन। दोस्तों, गुड इवनिंग। मैं आपके साथ एक ऐसे टॉपिक पे बात करने वाला हूँ विच नोबडी इज डिस्कसिंग सो मच और विच इज नॉट गिवन द इम्पोर्टेंस विच इट शुड हैव बीन गिवन। मैं आपके साथ बात करने वाला हूँ द लाइकलीहुड ऑफ वॉर बिटवीन चाइना एंड रशिया। Now everybody will be wondering, Captain, what the hell are you talking, man? I say, China and Russia are allies. They are like big friends together. How can you go and say that they're going to fight together? But, gentlemen, there is a distinct possibility. And I'll remind you, yesterday, the Taiwan president, which is facing a threat from China, had made a statement when he advised the Chinese government to launch an attack against Russia. Why? So that they could get back those lost territories which the Russians had taken 140 years back. For that, we'll have to go back into history a little bit and see what it's all about. Tsars of the Russian Empire, who ruled the mighty Russian state, began to colonize areas in Central Asia and the Far East. And by 1880, they had occupied the northeast portion of China. That is right up to the city of Vladivostok. Now, this area historically was always part of China, and the Russians colonized it around 1880. And this entire area actually was a part of the Chinese Empire. But China had become weak. In 1842, they had the first Opium War, 1856, the second Opium War, and in 1900, they had the Boxer Rebellion, in all of which they were defeated. Once the Chinese were defeated, they had lost their power, and then there was a civil war. They were fighting between the Kuomintang and the communists, and the Japanese invaded and occupied Manchuria, and these areas could not be reclaimed by China, which had been occupied by Russia. There's a huge area, as you can see on the map. You can see any map of that period, and you will find that Russia has taken a huge area of China and put their own people there, and of course built that famous port of Vladivostok, which is the headquarters of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Now, China was a weak country at that time, and obviously they had to agree. And later on, as you all know, Manchuria was occupied by China, and most of this border with Russia was with Manchuria. And the Japanese called this state Manchukuo, and they had put Emperor Puyi, the titular head of the state. So, and the Russians and the Japanese did have a war in 38-39, but they made amends, they made peace, and this entire area, Japan gifted it to Russia, and they were not interested in fighting the Russians on this area. So the matter became status quo till 1949, when the Communist Party won the battle and Mao Tse Tung came into power. But immediately when they came into power, the Chinese said, we are going to reclaim all the lost territories which we have lost to various countries. But there was an exception with Russia, because Russia was a place which was having a communist regime at that time, and there was what was known as the USSR. And China also had a communist regime, and the communists in China could not forget the fact that all the weaponry which was with the Japanese army, which the Russians had captured, was handed over to the Chinese, and they used them very skillfully in their battle against Chiang Kai-shek. So they were grateful to the Russians, that they didn't want to open up the can of worms at that time. Subsequently, Russia became a nuclear power, and Russia then, of course, was super powerful, and it was a global power. The USSR was a sort of antidote to the American hegemony, and the Chinese were not prepared to face up to Russia, and they thought America is the biggest danger, because it had propped up the strait across the Strait of Taiwan, the Republic of Formosa, or Taiwan as it's called now. So the Chinese were biding their time, and they have been making threatening noises to capture Formosa. And in the light of these threats, where the Chinese aircraft carriers, the naval ships and the warships, and the Chinese army in the mainland getting ready for an amphibious assault on Taiwan, have been reminded by the president of Taiwan that Russia has taken away thousands of square miles of Chinese territory, and what is China going to do about it? Gentlemen, I am firmly of the view that China is biding its time. They are an ally of Russia at the moment, but that is more of a necessity, rather a marriage of convenience, because China alone cannot face the American might. That is why the Chinese also cannot allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, and they are supplying them with weapons and with components to keep the war alive. In fact, the Russian economy is being kept afloat by the Chinese. And that's a point which we must bear in mind and think what it means. So what it means at the moment as it stands, gentlemen, is very clear that China is marking time and Russia is becoming weaker. Because one thing is very clear, the Russians, by getting entangled in Ukraine, have exposed the entire Far East. As it stands now, I think the Chinese, if they were just to move into these areas which have been taken by the Russians, it would be a hands-up victory straight away. Because the Russians do not have much of manpower there. The entire army, their resources are committed in the battle in Ukraine. And 2.5 years elapsed, and the Russians have not been able to beat the Ukrainians. And that is the very sad part of it. There's the famed Red Army which carried out those tank battles against the Wehrmacht in Kharkiv and the plains of Ukraine. Is unable to subdue the Ukrainians. And for that, who is to be blamed? It's the Russians themselves and Vladimir Putin. Now you may ask me, how is it possible, that Putin is responsible? Well, the fact is he was having a very unrealistic approach of the battle. He should have read Gouliat, de Hooth and Michel, the proponents of air power. That is, air power can be decisive if used in the proper way. So when the battle commenced against Ukraine, he took it, Vladimir took it as a walk in the park, and he didn't believe in total annihilation of the Ukrainians. In fact, after the first day of battle, he made an appeal to the Ukrainian army to lay down arms, thinking it's going to be a walkover, but then he should have realized, and he probably knew, that the Americans are not going to give the Russians a walkover, and so they steeled up the defenses of Ukraine and the battle commenced. The Russian army, which had moving towards Kharkiv and Kiev, had to get back, and then they had to regroup and come in the Donbass region. Now they are making big gains in Donbass region, but a small portion of their territory in Kursk has been occupied by Ukraine. So what's going to happen next? Russia is tied down in Ukraine. That's the crux of the matter. The fast east is exposed, and China, if required, can take over the entire area immediately. But they're not going to do it, not now, because they have the bigger danger to face, and that is the United States of America. The Americans will not allow China global dominance. That's very clear. And that is the reason they are propping up India for it. So what's going to happen next? Well, what's going to happen next is that it's going to be mark time, that is Kadam Tal, as we say in military parades, and they will do on-the-spot marching till such time as China becomes the number one power in the world, and that is the time they turn their attention to Russia. And it's going to be very difficult, mighty difficult for the Russians to defend this region, because the population there is sparse, And China, on the other hand, has got millions and millions of people. They can just flood that area and develop it. And alternatively, the only choice would be a nuclear exchange. I don't think Russia would be interested, neither China. So it could be anything, a fait accompli. And just as China is claiming the borders, with borderlands with India, saying they're a relic of the British Raj and we don't recognize it, similarly, China could at that stage say we don't recognize the areas which have been taken by the Tsar, and we would like to get that area back. Well, at least they could start negotiations or something, and that will weaken Russia, just like a weakened India is unable to put pressure on China. I don't know how the Russians will be able to put any pressure on China at all. So, gentlemen, it's a very tricky situation. I think I'm giving you food for thought. There is a lot of area which the Russians have occupied as far as China is concerned, which was part of the Chinese Empire earlier. And now, right up to Vladivostok, the Chinese can claim the entire territory. There are people in China who want those areas back, though the government is just silent about it, and we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen in future. America, of course, would like to stoke the embers, the fire, to see that it glows up. But America itself has got a big problem as to defend Formosa. And at the moment, I don't think the Chinese have the amphibious capability to launch the invasion, but sooner than later they will do it. And China's internal problems is what is going to probably break them up. I think as per the reports which I'm getting, there's a lot of unrest in the Chinese army against President Yi. And that is the crucial point. Yi seems to have become a little powerless man, and he's marking time. And maybe you don't know what's going to happen. And if the People's Liberation Army takes over and puts another man in charge, it will be a different ball game altogether. America also is now facing a lot of crisis, by getting into the war with Ukraine for no rhyme or reason. The Russians are, of course, I don't know how long they're going to fight. And probably the coming elections on the 4th of November, the American elections probably decide which way is what's going to happen. But as far as the border with Russia is concerned, it can be opened anytime by China, saying it's a historical necessity and it could lead to a military clash. The Russians are on a weak wicket there, and as they keep on fighting in Ukraine, they'll be weaker still in the Far East. So, gentlemen, bear this in mind. I hope you like this video of mine. Share it with your friends and come back for more. In the meanwhile, I'll say goodbye and God bless. And make it a point to subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. I hope so. Goodbye and God bless.